Well, hello and welcome to the first installment of our electricity generation training. Today we'll focus on the current state of the industry and in particular the current state of AECC's generation fleet and market position. And I'm joined with Colin DeRink, who is Vice President of Power Production, and Andrew Lahosky, who is Vice President of Market Operations. And so, Colin and Andrew, let's start off discussing reliability. And so according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, U.S. electricity customers suffered about 7 hours on average of electricity interruption in 2021. Now, most of that was due to storms. There was a couple hours that were not due to storms. And if you looked at kind of where those interruptions occurred, they were primarily in northern regions of the country and coastal regions. Bottom line is it's pretty reliable. You know, a couple hours out of a year is not many hours. I know when I go home today, I can flip on the light switch and I'm pretty confident the lights are going to come on. So what makes the U.S. electricity grid so reliable?
Well, we are part of the Eastern Interconnect here, so fortunate that we're all tied together on the eastern part of the United States. And so we can, at least to some extent, lean on our neighbors when we need to. In addition to that, of course, we have to have a planning reserve margin. That just means our loads are at a certain level that they peak, but above and beyond that, we have to bring additional generating resources to the table, and that's required from the reliability coordinators, SPP and MISO.
So you mentioned this planning reserve margin. I mean, how is that set? I mean, how do they determine what that amount is?
And it comes back to what does it take to be reliable? Again, Southwest Power Pool, the SPP and Mid-Continent Independent System Operator does a study every year and says that we want to have a very high level of reliability. So what does that planning reserve margin need to be? So the SPP, for example, it's 15% right now, but they're talking about, and MISO is too, increasing that for the winter time, given that we've had some issues recently with winter reliability.
Colin mentioned interconnection. I mean, what other thoughts do you have that leads to reliability?
So Andrew hit on the interconnection of the grid overall. And then I think of, from a power production standpoint, the various plants and assets that are in that grid, right? You've got hundreds of plants on the system of a diverse source of electricity generation as well that makes a big difference for us. And so if you have, because of that interconnectivity, if you have an issue, for example, at one given generation plant, others are able to pick up that shortfall, if you will. And then from the diversity standpoint, you've got this diverse mix of fuel resources. So if you should have issues, for example, getting coal to a coal plant, gas to a gas plant, if the wind isn't blowing or is, vice versa, you've got that diversity that helps balance things out too.
Well, you mentioned that there's a diversity of resources in those areas, SPP and MISO. AECC operates a diversity of resources as well. Can you guys tell us kind of what kind of plants AECC has at its disposal? What are the resources that we own and operate?
Yeah, currently we're really diverse. So a little over a third of our resources are coal. A little over a third are the combined cycle natural gas. That's the more efficient natural gas. And then a little less than 10% is gas steam and gas simple cycle, a little less efficient gas. And then we have the wind at 11%, hydro at 8%, and with Woodruff County Solar, we'll have solar at 4%. So a very diverse mix that we have, at least currently.
Is that creating problems from an operations standpoint? I know you're responsible for operations when you have this diversity of portfolio. Is that a hindrance or maybe a comfort to you to have kind of a difference in portfolio?
Well, I certainly think it's a benefit. I mean, it can raise some challenges in terms of knowledge of technologies and so forth with different plants, and they have their own dynamics, of course. But I think the overall diversity that Andrew kind of just described is a big advantage for us at AECC.
Now, you mentioned what our portfolio mix is. Can either of you speak a little bit to what the diversity of resources is within SPP or MISO, the two markets that we operate in? And then are there any changes to what those resources are today, trends or kind of future changes that you see?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, and Andrew, I'm sure you're probably more even familiar with it than I, but there's definitely a diverse mix in both SPP and MISO resources. But we're certainly seeing a change, to your point and to your question, as we see coal plants retire. We've seen over a number of years many coal plants retire, as we know, and that is expected to continue, most of which those are being replaced with renewable resources, right? And so this kind of starts that discussion of dispatchable versus non and the changes that we're seeing there. Not an equivalent generation resource, as I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit more here as we go forward.
And Andrew, I know working with you in market operations, one of the things we have to do is kind of forecast not only what our load is, but what generation is going to show up. Can you speak to a little bit about the difficulties in forecasting both wind and solar in the market and kind of what that does to operations?
Right. Well, we're just now starting to have to forecast solar, so don't have a lot of experience. But we think that might be easier than the wind. The wind that we have is extremely variable, and to even forecast, we're having to do that per day ahead every day. To be able to achieve a forecast accuracy of 80% is considered good. It's hard to predict what the wind is going to do for the following day.
Yeah, it's fun watching the weather forecast. They're not even accurate on the temperature or the rain, let alone the wind and speed and direction. So definitely I could see some challenges. We get that difference in mix. And so speaking about these challenges, and we talk about AECC's mission of being reliable, affordable, and responsible. So let's talk a little bit about affordability. Building, owning, and operating generating plants is very expensive. I think AECC's book value is somewhere around $2 billion. So very expensive to have all these plants. And based on my research, it looks like investor-owned utilities, at least, spend on average about $150 billion a year in capital improvements. And I would assume that cooperatives and municipals are in that same boat. So there's $300 billion of capital being spent annually in this industry. And for AECC, I know we budget about $100 million annually. How do we maintain affordable rates when you're spending that kind of money?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I would start off, well, the numbers that you just referenced, I think from any standard, it's a lot of money. But when you look at it from what we spend to maintain versus the cost of those assets initially, it's fairly small, actually. The next thing I would highlight is those assets produce, generally speaking, a large volume of product, i.e. electricity for us, right? And they do that over a very long time period. For fossil plants, it's quite common to have a 30 to 40 year life expectancy of that asset. And so it can produce a tremendous amount of energy over that time, which in turn, of course, creates benefit for our members. And then when you move to the hydroelectric side, you're talking more on the 100-year mark for longevity of an asset like that, right? So those are kind of a couple of the main things that I see.
And the costs that you mentioned, you make that investment and it's pretty level over time. Where we have difficulty is with the fuel costs and when we're having to go out and purchase power, when it's really cold outside, for example. That's where we've really struggled with our costs most recently.
Yeah, and I want to kind of highlight that a little bit. In the last couple of years, I know our CEO, Buddy Haston, has mentioned several times, you go back 3 or 4 years, and we were always in those top 3 or 4 cooperatives in the country with cost of energy to members. And then over the last couple of years, we kind of flipped and we've kind of gone down. So this rise in cost to members, what do you see as the primary driver for this increase in cost of energy from AECC?
First of all, I just mentioned the winter storms. February 2021 is going to stick in my mind for a long time. That was Winter Storm Uri, which was really somewhat of a game changer, I think, for our industry. We were having to curtail members here for the very first time. And so it was painful, but it was also painful financially, approximately $100 million cost to us, both from high natural gas prices and not having adequate resources online, so having to purchase some very expensive power at that time. And then skip forward to a year ago, right before Christmas. So that was December of 2021, Winter Storm Elliott. That wasn't $100 million, but maybe half of that, $50 million. Some of the similar issues, high natural gas prices, plant performance not as good as we would have liked. And then last year, 2022, what we saw was something different than the winter storms. We saw natural gas prices increasing. So through the summer, they were in the $8 to $9 range, which was 3 times higher than what we had been seeing for natural gas prices. And then issues with being able to get adequate coal. So coal is our hedge against natural gas, and Entergy was having difficulty getting adequate delivery. So hit there with the fuel prices in 2022.
Yeah, so I know fuel definitely plays a big piece in that. I know, having worked with you, that the planning reserve margin and kind of what's going on with MISO, and they've changed their accreditation. So what are we doing now maybe to help improve affordability of rates? And I think including maybe improving our operating performance at our plants.
Right, exactly, yeah. We haven't touched on operational excellence yet, and that's a big piece and part of this. And poor performance of the plants, to Andrew's earlier point, affects our capacity and our accreditation of that as well. So from an operational perspective, simple things in how we operate the plant, from operator rounds to the maintenance side of the house, where you look at your preventative maintenance practices and the periodicity of those practices and so forth, right? The other big piece that I would mention in this, I think, as I'm fairly new to the organization, is just my division. We need to work and communicate together to make sure that we're getting the best value out of these assets. And there's a lot of conversations and work that we can do in sharing practices and learning what's best in these markets by working with Andrew's team to that end.
And I know, Andrew, we just recently started hedging.
That's right.
So tell us a little bit about what that is and how does that benefit us from an affordability standpoint?
Yeah, maybe less so for what we saw with Winter Storm Uri and Winter Storm Elliott, but last year the board approved a financial gas hedging program. So starting in August, we began to purchase some financial gas hedges, looking out 3 years. So currently, for the first year of the program, we're allowed to get up to 40% of what our expected needs are. So for the next 6 months, we're locked in at 40% of our gas needs being financially hedged.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I mentioned at the board meeting yesterday was, hedging tends to keep the cost more level. It may or may not result in savings. Sometimes it results in huge savings, but other times it can be a little bit of a cost. For the most part, it keeps it nice and level, so we don't see these huge spikes.
That's right.
Let's transition now. We've talked about reliability. We've talked about affordability. Let's spend a little bit of time on responsibility. And climate change seems to dominate the news cycle. Every time you hear there's something, whether it's a wildfire or a hurricane, it doesn't matter. They're going to blame it on climate change. And but if you look at emissions from traditional power plants over time, I think it's about a 23% reduction in CO2 since 2012, 43% reduction in nitrous oxides, which would be ozone, and then a 70% reduction in sulfur dioxides. And so when you think about these improvements in emissions reductions, how is AECC improving their, responsibility when you think about emissions or climate change now?
Starting in the 1980s, I think Ellis came online in 1988. We were making investments in hydro when there were very few folks out there, very few utilities making such investments. So you mentioned hydro being a 100-year investment. Our board was certainly taking a long-term view. And then it was 1993 for Willock and 98 for HS2. So those resources continue to be great resources for us, providing effectively carbon-free power. So,
right.
And then, along those lines, we made some investments with Oswald and Magnet Cove and the very efficient gas plants. Those certainly are more efficient and provide low carbon relative to coal plants. And then 5 wind power purchase agreements, 474 megawatts since that period. So some significant investment, if you will, in the wind resources. No carbon there either. Directionally, we've certainly gone to making low carbon investments and contracts.
Yeah. And most recently, I would just add the Woodruff County Solar Project, of course, right? That's another move in that direction for sure.
Yeah, definitely another zero carbon emitting resource. And I know back in the 2012 timeframe, we scrubbed and cleaned up Flint Creek. We're partnered with that. We were a participant in the Turk plant, which is a very ultra supercritical efficient coal plant. So we've done a lot. I see AECC's environmental performance has definitely improved over the last couple of decades. Now, when you think about that, environmentalist groups would still say that we can rely on non-fossil resources. There's plenty of sunshine, there's plenty of wind, you can put batteries out there, whatever else. And if you think about that, is that the responsible thing to do? Is that what we should be looking at or looking towards as AECC moves forward?
Definitely not. I think we all know definitely not from a reliability standpoint. To your statement there that there would be a thought that there's plenty of wind and plenty of sun. There may be at times, but not at all hours of all days, right? And so that's really important for us. Those renewable assets then are non-dispatchable. We don't have control of the wind, we don't have control of the sun, and we all need our lights to come on at all hours and so forth, right? You need that fossil generation backup at this point. It also brings us into some storage conversations where you just simply don't currently have the storage technology or capacity for batteries to really have a large impact. Yeah, it would be irresponsible to go in that direction, I believe.
And I would just add, I think the key word is we can rely on them solely. The answer is no. I mean, you can rely on them when the wind is blowing and when the sun is shining, but that doesn't happen all the time. So that's why continues to be the need for backup fossil resources, dispatchable.
I know AECC is looking at the closure of White Bluff and Independence coming up here in 28 and 2030. So we're going to have the need for new resources. Plus we've got load growth. What's AECC planning to do? I mean, we've got a supply our members with power. So what is AECC planning to build? Go ahead, Andrew.
All right. Well, there's 3 resources that we're actually looking at currently. The expansion at Fitzhugh with some small combustion turbines, and then longer term for replacements for White Bluff and Independence, we're looking at.
So would we also consider then opportunities for wind or solar or other resources? Do you see a space for them as well?
I certainly do. Yeah, I certainly do. Obviously, getting the first of our own solar projects under our belt at Woodruff is important, but I think that's just the first step, and I think there'll be additional steps to follow where the opportunity presents themselves. There is a place for that. I think that diverse mix and that the balance of power, of course, that Buddy talks about and references, right? It's just all a part of that portfolio. That diversity is important, creates balance and reliability for us. So,
and I think from my perspective, I see that as well, is that we're limited. I don't think there's any way we could build another coal plant. Nuclear is too expensive, and we'll talk in another session about new technologies. But, I do see wind and solar and potentially batteries being a great way to diversify or minimize the risk of fuel exposure going forward. And so kind of to wrap things up, we talked about how reliable the system is. We've talked about affordability. We've talked about reliability. But what challenges, opportunities, or threats do you see AECC facing to maintain reliable, affordable, and responsible power going forward?
I think number one is reliance on natural gas. We've seen that price can be highly volatile. So there's certainly fear on my part that we will get significant natural gas and then it'll go back up to $10 and it will be very painful cost-wise. So, of course, that's why we're doing the hedging and trying to find ways to mitigate that, including adding additional renewable resources. But nonetheless, we're still going to be really relying a lot on natural gas. There's no way around that.
I think the one I would highlight is environmental regulation. There's some unknowns out there in terms of what future environmental regulation looks like. We're seeing the effects of it or have seen the effects of it with coal plant closures, as we've discussed a little bit here this afternoon, but there may be more coming down the road, right? And some of that may not mean retirement or forced retirement of additional fossil assets, but it could just mean increased costs, right? It could mean increased costs for emissions for our existing plants, for example, or new technology that needs to be applied, further investment. Different impacts there from an environmental regulation standpoint.
We definitely have some big challenges and I think some great opportunities, but Colin and Andrew, appreciate your time today. And I think as we go through the rest of this series, we'll talk more about renewables, their intermittency versus dependable capacity. We'll talk about maybe what new technologies are out there, environmental compliance and regulations, and a few other things. And so again, thank you for your time today.